The phone rang just as the light began to fade over Charleston Bay. My mother's name glowed on the screen, elegant cursive against the soft hum of my apartment. I hesitated before answering, my fingers hovering already, knowing what was coming. When I finally picked up, her voice came through, crisp, rehearsed, like a speech she'd practiced in the mirror. "Sweetheart," she said about the wedding, "it's best if you don't come." I froze. Why, a pause, the sound of her exhale brushing the receiver. "You've been through rough patches lately. It's not that we don't love you, but people talk. It's better if we avoid awkwardness. You don't quite fit the image we're going for." My throat felt dry. "What image is that? You know how these things look," she sighed. "Your sister's marrying into a very visible family. There will be press, investors, friends from the firm. We just don't want anyone whispering." I could hear the clinking of glasses in the background, laughter, the faint echo of celebration from a house I hadn't stepped inside in years. Then came the final blow, soft but lethal. "You look poor, darling. It would embarrass your sister." The words fell with surgical precision, each one cutting where it hurt most. I said nothing at first, just listened to my own heartbeat, heavy and slow. Then I said, "All right, ils vont come." There was a silence long enough for me to imagine her relief. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, her voice brightening instantly. "You're always so understanding." When I hung up, I sat on the couch for a long time, staring at the muted light from the street lamp spilling across the floorboards. My reflection in the window looked ghost-like, familiar yet distant. Outside, the evening tide whispered against the docks, calm and indifferent. I looked around my apartment, the chipped white paint, the uneven table legs, the small fern I'd kept alive for 3 years. Everything here was mine, earned, not gifted, built without applause. My mother would call it humble. I called it home. Still, her words echoed in the air like perfume that refused to fade. Poor, embarrassing. I pressed my palms against my knees, grounding myself. That tone, half pity, half superiority, had followed me my whole life. It started when I was a child, when she'd introduce us at church potlucks. "This is Madeline, our little star, and this is Elena, our strong one." Strong meant quiet. Strong meant invisible. The phone buzzed again. A group message. Old school friends sending photos of the bridal party, champagne glasses, gold decor, a caption that read number, "Madeline and Ethan forever." My name wasn't anywhere. Someone commented, "Isn't Elena coming?" Another replied, "Not sure. Maybe she's busy." Busy being erased, I thought. I tossed the phone aside and went to the window. The city shimmered in the distance, lights flickering over the marsh. Somewhere out there, my sister was probably rehearsing her vows, surrounded by people who'd never heard my name. The refrigerator hummed softly. I opened it out of habit, though I wasn't hungry. Leftover soup, a carton of milk, a single piece of chocolate wrapped in foil. I unwrapped it slowly, the way you might open a memory, and let it melt on my tongue. Madeline had always gotten the center of everything. The biggest bedroom, the newest dress, the attention that poured like sunlight. When we were younger, I used to braid her hair before school while she practiced smiling in the mirror. "You're so lucky," she'd say, "you don't care about what people think." But I did. I just learned early that no one was listening. I walked to my small desk by the window and opened my sketchbook. A half-finished design, stared back lines for a modern beach villa I'd been conceptualizing for a client. My pencils were scattered, the eraser worn down to its metal rim. I flipped to a new page and started drawing without thinking. Soft curves, steady angles, a shape that began to form itself. Not a house this time. A box, square, simple, wrapped in silk. I shaded it gently, imagining the texture smooth, cold, weighty in the hands. A ribbon tied across the top. A note tucked beneath it. The kind of thing that looks delicate but holds power. I could almost see it sitting on a table, surrounded by flowers and champagne flutes waiting to be opened. The idea settled inside me like a quiet spark. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to defend my worth. I would simply send a reminder, silent, undeniable, impossible to ignore. I leaned back, and looked around the apartment again. On the wall hung a photo of me at 21, standing beside my first interior project, a modest cafe in Savannah. I'd painted the walls myself, built the tables from reclaimed wood, and still smelled of sawdust when the owners handed me my first check. I remembered how proud I'd been when I told my mother. She had said, "That's nice, dear." "When will you find something more stable?" I smiled faintly. Stability in her world was measured by how others applauded you. In mine, it was the ability to breathe without someone's approval. The phone lit up again. A new message from my father. Just 2 words. She didn't mean it. I stared at the screen for a moment before setting it face down. Of course she meant it. My father's silence had always been his way of keeping peace. He'd rather excuse cruelty than confront it. The clock ticked past 9. Outside, the streetlights shimmered against the rain-streaked pavement. I poured myself a glass of water, the motion grounding me. For a long moment, I just stood there, tracing the rim of the glass with my finger, thinking about how many times I'd been told to understand, to forgive, to stay quiet. No more. I walked back to the sketchbook and added one more detail to the drawing, a faint outline of an embossed seal in the corner of the lid. I wrote the word gift beneath it, then closed the book. Some gifts are louder than words. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders and stepped out onto the balcony. The air smelled of salt and rain. Boats swayed gently in the harbor, below their lights blinking like patient hearts. Somewhere far away, thunder rumbled low and steady, as if agreeing with my decision. They didn't want me there. That was fine. I wasn't coming to their perfect little stage anyway. But when the applause faded and the music stopped, they'd open what I sent, and remember the daughter they tried so hard to forget. I stood there until the wind picked up, carrying away the last trace of hesitation. Then I whispered into the night, not bitter, just certain. "They won't see me there," I said softly, "but they'll see what I've become." The rain had stopped by morning, but the air inside my apartment still felt heavy, as if the storm hadn't really left. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice again, calm, polished, and cruel. "You look poor, darling. It would embarrass your sister." The words had rooted somewhere deep in me, and even in silence they echoed. I made coffee and sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the photo box I hadn't opened in years. It was tucked away in the back of my closet, filled with the things I'd kept when I moved out: old report cards, postcards from classmates, and family photos that never looked quite like family. I lifted the lid and began sifting through the fragments. There was one photo that always caught me: Madeline in her white piano recital dress curls, perfect smile practiced. Our mother stood behind her, hands resting proudly on her shoulders. I was there too, in the background, still wearing my apron from the bakery. My smile looked thin, almost polite, like I already understood my place in the picture. That photo pulled me backward in time to the kitchen where I spent most of my childhood. The house always smelled faintly of bleach and lemon polish. I'd stand on a stool washing dishes while Madeline painted her nails at the counter, humming off-key to whatever song was popular that week. Mom would praise her for being so delicate, so graceful, then look at me and say, "You're the strong one, Elena. You'll always land on your feet." I didn't realize until years later that strong was just her way of saying you'll get less. Once when I was 12, I asked if I could take piano lessons too. Mom didn't even look up from the grocery list she was writing. "Sweetheart, Madeline has a gift for music. You're good with practical things." Dad, buried behind his newspaper, didn't say a word. I remember standing there clutching a dish towel, feeling invisible and clumsy all at once. They made it sound like fairness was a luxury the family couldn't afford. High school didn't change much. I was the reliable one. The one who walked the neighbor's dog, helped teachers after class, stayed late to clean up the art room. I got good grades, earned a scholarship, and no one seemed surprised. When I won a regional science award senior year, the school hosted a small ceremony. I came home carrying a plaque and found Mom already helping Madeline choose a dress for her spring dance. "That's nice, honey," she said when I showed her. Now don't be late for dinner." A week later, when Madeline got featured in the school newsletter for being most likely to succeed, Mom threw her a party. I told myself it didn't matter. Success didn't need applause. But that night, lying awake in my small room, I realized how deep that silence could cut. It wasn't that I hated my sister. Not then. She wasn't cruel, not in the beginning. She just lived in a world where everything was built for her. When she broke a vase, I was the one who swept it up. When she forgot her lunch, I gave her mine. When she cried after her first breakup, I held her while Mom whispered, "She's too sensitive, poor thing," as if being sensitive were a virtue. But when I cried, the few times I dared, Mom sighed. "You're tougher than that, Elena. Don't make a scene." When I was 18, I got into the University of Georgia on a partial scholarship. I still remember holding the acceptance letter like it was a key to some secret world. But when I told my parents, they exchanged that look, the one that meant there was something I hadn't considered. "We can't help with moving expenses," Dad said flatly. "Not right now. You know we're paying for Madeline's debutante ball." I laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. I worked 3 part-time jobs that summer to make it happen. When I finally moved into the dorms, Mom told neighbors I had decided to stay home for a bit. She didn't want to explain that her eldest had to scrub floors and stack shelves just to afford a future. I tried to call home the first few weeks. Sometimes no one picked up. When they did, they talked about Madeline, her grades, her prom dress, the scholarship she might get. I'd listen, nodding silently on my end, until the call ended with the same line every time: "We're proud of you too, sweetheart. Stay strong." Now, sitting in my Charleston apartment years later, that phrase made me laugh, quiet and bitter. Strong. The word had become a cage. I walked to the mirror by the entryway and looked at myself the way I used to as a kid, trying to find what was so wrong with me that love couldn't stay. My reflection was calm, older, softer around the eyes. "Strong," I whispered, testing the word like it was foreign. Then I said it again, differently: "Free." Pepper, my rescue mutt, patted over and pressed his head against my leg. I scratched behind his ears, grateful for the simple loyalty of something that never asked for more than kindness. Maybe that's why I loved animals. They didn't pretend. They didn't rank affection. A sudden flash of memory hit me the day I moved out for good. I was 24, working at a downtown design firm, saving every spare dollar. When I told Mom I'd found a small apartment, she arched an eyebrow. "So you're really doing this?" she asked. "You think you can manage alone?" I smiled. "I already have." She didn't come to help me pack. The memory faded as quickly as it came. I looked around my apartment: secondhand furniture, art supplies, stacked neatly, a few indoor plants fighting for light. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. Every inch of it built by my own hands. The phone buzzed on the table, a group message. Ward family chat. My thumb hovered before I opened it. Photos poured in Madeline's bridal shower champagne glasses, raised, everyone beaming in coordinated white. Mom captioned it, "Our beautiful bride glowing with love. No mention of me." I watched the screen until it blurred, then deleted the chat without replying. I turned off my phone and poured more coffee. The bitterness tasted clean, almost grounding. I thought of all the times I'd been told to stay quiet, to play along, to make things easier for everyone else. Maybe that's why silence had become my second language. But something in me had shifted since last night. Silence, I realized, didn't have to mean surrender. It could mean control. I opened my sketchbook and flipped to a blank page. The drawing from the night before, the silk-wrapped box, peeked through from the next sheet. I began sketching again, refining the lines, shaping the bow. It was strange how calm I felt, as if my mind had found a gear that finally fit. Each stroke of the pencil was deliberate, precise. The box wasn't revenge yet. It was a message, a statement. A creation meant to be seen by those who had never really looked at me. The first true piece of art I'd ever make for myself. As the morning light shifted, I whispered aloud, "Strength isn't silence. It's knowing when to speak in a language they'll finally understand." I closed the sketchbook, exhaled slowly, and felt the weight of years lift off my chest. My family's version of love had always come with conditions. This quiet, steady planning was unconditional. It was mine. Pepper barked once as if in agreement. I smiled and said softly, "You and me, buddy. We build from nothing." The clock on the wall ticked gently, marking the moment I stopped being the forgotten daughter. The house I grew up in had been built on appearances and approval. Mine, I decided, would be built on truth. Outside, the clouds began to break, sunlight spilling through the window like a quiet promise. I stood there, eyes half closed, letting the warmth find my face. Somewhere deep inside, I felt it, a pulse small but certain, the start of something that finally belonged to me. The first light of morning crept across the floorboards, thin and golden. I woke without an alarm, the way I always did now. The air smelled of rain and roasted coffee from the cafe below. It was a quiet, easy start, the kind that used to feel foreign to me. I watered the fern on the windowsill, fed Pepper, and opened the curtains to the slow rhythm of Charleston waking up. The docks shimmered in the distance, boats rocking softly. For the first time in years, peace felt like something I could touch. My studio occupied the small second bedroom, a jumble of sketches, paint swatches, and half-empty coffee mugs. The walls were lined with reclaimed wood shelves holding books about architecture, design, and the psychology of space. I liked thinking that what I created had weight, that it could hold people, give them something they didn't even know they needed: safety. At 9, I opened my laptop and reviewed emails. 2 new project inquiries, 1 client payment pending, and 1 rejection. The rejection didn't sting the way it used to. I had learned that failure wasn't a closed door, it was just an old one that didn't fit the frame anymore. I sipped my coffee and went back to sketching. By 10, I was at my downtown studio, a converted attic above a bakery, barely 800 square feet, but flooded with sunlight. I'd found the space 2 years ago, back when my old boss at a corporate design firm took credit for my work on a luxury hotel project. I had walked out that same week, taking only my portfolio and a stapler I'd bought myself. For months I lived off oatmeal and coffee, taking any freelance job that came my way. But I never went back. Now the studio smelled like sawdust and fresh paint. On one table sat a set of blueprints for a coastal cottage renovation, a project for a widow named Mrs. Hanley. She wanted her late husband's fishing shack turned into a reading retreat. I'd spent hours designing it down to the smallest detail. When she came to the studio last week, she ran her fingers along the rendering and said, "You make spaces feel safe." I didn't know what to say. No one had ever used that word about me before. Around noon, my mentor Liam Hayes stopped by. He was a retired architect in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that always seemed to see through pretense. I met him at a design expo in Savannah the year I started over. He'd stopped in front of my booth, studied my work, and said, "You design like someone who survived something." I remember smiling awkwardly. Maybe survival just looks like clean lines and steady walls. He laughed, offered me a consulting contract, and over time became the closest thing I had to family. He stepped into the studio that day carrying 2 coffees. "You look too serious for this early," he said, handing me one. "Deadlines don't care about moods," I said. He looked around, noticing the sketches scattered across my drafting table. "You've been busy." "I can't stop," I admitted. "The ideas won't let me sleep." He smiled, taking a seat. "That's when you know you're doing it right." We went over plans for a new project, an eco-friendly townhouse design on King Street. But my mind wandered as we talked. Every time Liam mentioned family or legacy, my chest tightened. Legacy was a word my mother used to love, but it meant something very different in her mouth. Liam caught me drifting. "Where's your head, Elena?" I hesitated, then said, "My sister's wedding is next month. It's all over the local papers." His expression softened. "That's the one who told me I shouldn't come because I'd embarrass her." I finished for him. He nodded slowly. "And how are you feeling about that?" "I'm not," I said. "Feeling, I mean." He studied me for a moment. That's not true. You're just channeling it into something else. I looked down at my sketches. Into precision, I said. Into silence that looks like control. He smiled faintly. Then use it. Let your work speak the words they'll never hear. That night after Liam left, I stayed late in the studio. I lit a small lamp, the kind that glowed like candlelight, and pulled out a different set of plans. A personal one I'd been working on for months. A villa near Mount Pleasant overlooking the marshlands. It wasn't commissioned, it was mine. I'd been designing it in secret, an architectural confession in the shape of a home. The lines were clean open, full of air. Large windows to let the light in. A staircase with no railing, just trust and balance. In every inch I'd drawn something I once needed: peace, belonging, dignity. I imagined standing there one day, barefoot on the tile, surrounded by silence that didn't hurt. When Liam first saw the design, he'd asked, "Is this for a client?" I told him. "Not yet." He'd smiled, understanding more than I said. "Then build it when you're ready." Now, as I adjusted the shading on the sketch, I thought about that villa again. I thought about my mother, about Madeline, about the idea of family as something that only looked beautiful from a distance. Maybe the villa wasn't just a dream. Maybe it was the answer to everything they'd tried to deny me. The following morning, my assistant Clara showed me an article on her phone. "You've seen this, right?" she asked, passing it over. It was a glossy magazine cover, Charleston Society Weekly. The headline read, "A Match Made in Heaven, Madeline Ward to Wed Ethan Crane." The photo showed my sister laughing beneath a canopy of white roses, Mom and Dad smiling on either side. The caption below, "Charleston's Wedding of the Year." My stomach turned, but not from jealousy. I'd designed that resort once years ago when I worked under a boss who never credited me. The grand palmetto, every archway, every chandelier mine. I knew every brick in that place. They were celebrating in the house I built. I closed the magazine and slid it back across the desk. "You can throw it out," I told Clara. That evening, I walked home slowly, passing through the narrow cobblestone streets lined with oak trees and hanging moss. The city hummed, quietly alive but never intrusive. By the time I reached my apartment, the tension had settled into something else, something colder, clearer. I poured a glass of wine and stood at the window watching the harbor lights flicker. The reflection in the glass looked steady, composed. I whispered, "You can't be excluded if you never wanted to belong." I opened my sketchbook again and flipped back to the page with the white silk box. It was just a rough concept then, but now the image sharpened in my mind. A gift that would say everything I didn't. A message written not in words, but in the language they understood: best presentation, perfection, appearances. I began drawing again, refining the edges of the ribbon, the folds of silk. I wrote next to it, "For those who see only surfaces." The night deepened. The city outside was still, rain threatening in the distance. I placed my pencil down, looked at the villa plans beside the sketch, and realized they belonged to the same story. The home I had built in silence, the box that would carry its truth. Pepper stirred from his bed and came to rest beside my chair. I reached down, brushing his fur, and said quietly, "They taught me to measure worth in things. Maybe it's time I showed them what I built while they were looking away." A storm began somewhere, out at sea, thunder rolling faintly through the window. The sound didn't scare me. It reminded me that power could exist quietly too, just waiting for the right moment to be heard. When I finally went to bed, I left the sketchbook open on the table. The lamplight caught the page, the box gleaming softly in graphite. It was beautiful in its simplicity, clean, deliberate, unapologetic. Tomorrow, I decided I'd start making calls. Not for revenge, for precision, for balance. They had chosen to define me by absence. I would answer with presence, silent, strong, and impossible to ignore. The morning light spilled through the window as I stirred sugar into my coffee, pretending not to see the notification glowing on my phone. Clara had texted twice already. "You need to read this." I sighed and opened the link she sent. The headline hit first: "Charleston's Sweetheart Madeline Ward's Fairy Tale Wedding." Below it, Glossy photos bled across my screen. My sister in a silk gown that shimmered like it had its own light. My mother standing beside her, chin lifted, pearls perfectly centered. My father's hand rested on Madeline's shoulder, proud and stiff as always. They were at the Grand Palmetto Resort. My resort. The one I'd helped design back when I was still invisible enough to be used. Every marble column, every arched doorway, it was my work, just signed by someone else's name. Seeing it wrapped in flowers and champagne glasses felt like watching a stranger steal a piece of my body and call it theirs. I scrolled down, and there it was. The bride's older sister, Elena Ward, could not be reached for comment. I stared at the sentence until the words blurred. Could not be reached. They made it sound like I'd vanished, like I'd fallen off the edge of the family map. Maybe I had. The sound of rain hit the window, soft at first, then harder, as if the sky wanted to echo me. I closed the laptop, pushed it aside, and went back to work. But my pencil kept slipping, lines turning messy. I gave up and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. And just like that, I was back in their house 2 years earlier at Madeline's engagement party. The memory came sharp and detailed: the flicker of candles, the smell of rosemary and roasted lamb. My mother had hired a jazz trio to play by the pool, and the whole yard glittered. I'd shown up in a simple blue dress, the only one I owned that didn't look like workwear. As I stepped through the door, Mom handed me a tray of hors d'oeuvres. The caterers are short-staffed, sweetheart. Be a dear and help out. I should have said no. Instead, I took the tray and began passing it around, while guests complimented Madeline's ring, her dress, her future. She floated through the room like a debutante out of a magazine, her laughter light and rehearsed. When someone asked about me, Mom cut in quickly, smiling, that tight public smile of hers. Elena's doing something creative, I think, freelance decorating. A few people nodded politely. Someone murmured, "How nice," in the kind of tone people reserve for hobbies that don't make money. I smiled, kept walking, and pretended my heart wasn't burning. Later, I found my father in his study pouring himself a drink. I stood in the doorway and said, "Did she really need me to serve food at my sister's engagement party?" He didn't look up. It's not about need. It's about keeping peace. You know how your mother gets. So, we just let her, I asked. We let her decide who belongs where. He sipped his scotch. You always make things harder than they need to be, Elena. It wasn't anger I felt. In that moment, it was recognition. That sentence summed up my entire childhood. I was always the disruption, the imbalance, the one who didn't quite fit the family photograph. Now, years later, the same pattern was repeating. I could see it all clearly, just dressed in white silk this time. That afternoon, I tried to focus on work, but the rain pressed against the windows like it wanted in. My phone buzzed again, a new post on social media. A photo of the bridal party, all smiles under crystal chandeliers. I scrolled through the comments, my stomach tight. Someone had tagged me beneath the picture, "Hope Elena's coming this time." The poor thing looked so out of place at the engagement party. Laughing emojis followed. I stared until my screen went dark. Then I deleted the app entirely. At 7 that evening, my phone rang. My mother's voice came bright and chirping through the line. "Just checking in, sweetheart. I wanted to make sure you're not planning any surprises at the wedding." "Surprises? You know," she said delicately, "sometimes emotions get the better of people. We just want the day to be perfect." I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Don't worry, Mom. I wouldn't dream of ruining the picture." She exhaled with relief. "You've always been so understanding. That's why I never worry about you." When the call ended, I stared at my reflection in the dark window. The city lights blurred behind me, turning my outline into something ghostly. "Maybe you should," I whispered. I couldn't shake the old memory that followed the day of Madeline's prom when I was 17 and she was 15. Her dress had arrived too long and Mom didn't want to spend money on alterations. I stayed up late hemming it, pricking my fingers raw. She looked perfect that night, and when people complimented the fit, she smiled and said, "I guess it was meant to be." Not one word about me. Later that night, when she came home glowing from compliments, she'd looked at me and said, "You shouldn't try so hard to act perfect. It makes people uncomfortable." The irony now would have been funny if it hadn't still stung. I went to my desk and opened my sketchbook. The drawing of the silk box stared back at me. The white ribbon I'd shaded looked softer than the real thing. I turned the pencil between my fingers, then wrote beneath it, "Some things are better built from nothing." It wasn't anger guiding my hand, it was precision. I wasn't plotting revenge, I was designing symmetry. They wanted perfection. I would give them something flawless, something that would force them to see me, even when I wasn't in the room. The following day, I stopped by a thrift boutique to look for materials for a client project. In the back corner hung a dress, vintage ivory, simple hand, stitched with faint embroidery at the cuffs. I ran my hand along the fabric. It was beautiful in an understated way, quiet but confident. The kind of beauty that didn't need anyone to notice it to exist. I tried it on. The fit was almost perfect. Standing before the mirror, I saw the version of myself my mother would never recognize, elegant without effort, graceful without permission. For a second, I imagined walking into that wedding wearing it, imagined the silence that would follow. But I didn't buy it. I didn't need to wear beauty to own it. When I returned to the studio that afternoon, Liam was waiting at the door with blueprints rolled under his arm. "You look distracted," he said. I shrugged. "Family things." He raised an eyebrow. "You've got that look again, the one people get right before they change their lives." "I'm just tired," I said. "No," he replied, setting the blueprints down. "You're focused. There's a difference." We worked for an hour before he paused, noticing the sketch of the silk box on my desk. He studied it quietly, then looked up. "Whatever this is, finish it. You need to see it through." His words settled over me like a seal. "Finish it." That night, when the city lights flickered across the bay, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. My lawyer's name, Mr. Green, sat at the top of my contacts list. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before I began typing. "Dear Mr. Green, I'd like to discuss transferring the title of my Mount Pleasant property to my sister Madeline Ward. The documentation should arrive no later than Friday morning at the Grand Palmetto Resort. I want it delivered to the bride personally." I read the email twice before pressing send. The click sounded final, deliberate. The room felt still afterward, like the air itself was waiting to exhale. I looked down at Pepper, sleeping soundly beside my chair. "They want perfection," I said softly. "I'll give them exactly that." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the palm trees. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. It felt like the prelude to something inevitable, something sharp and clean, that would finally make sense of every quiet humiliation I'd ever endured. I turned off the lamp and stood at the window. The harbor lights glittered across the water like small truths, steady and patient. The world below was calm. For the first time in a long time, so was I. The air inside Mr. Green's office smelled faintly of cedar and fresh ink. The blinds were half drawn, letting in thin bands of morning light that striped across the polished wood desk. He was a quiet man, deliberate in every motion, the kind of lawyer who measured his words like currency. He adjusted his glasses, looked up from the stack of documents, and said, "So you're sure about this?" "Yes." My voice didn't waver. "The villa's title will go to my sister, effective immediately." Mr. Green frowned slightly, as if trying to read between the lines. "It's quite a gift, Miss Ward. I just want to make sure you're aware, once it's signed, it's final. You can't revoke it." I leaned forward, elbows on the cool edge of his desk. "I don't intend to." He studied me for a moment longer, then slid the final form across the desk. The paper was heavy-textured, embossed with the seal of the state. I picked up the pen and signed my name, Elena Margaret Ward. The letters looked calm, controlled, like they belonged to someone who no longer shook. Mr. Green cleared his throat. "Any message to include with the deed?" I smiled faintly. "Just this." I handed him a small ivory card with 4 handwritten words. Some things are better built from nothing. He nodded, his expression unreadable, and pressed the notary seal into the bottom corner of the form. The gold stamp shimmered under the light. When I left his office, the sun outside was blinding. The city was already buzzing, but I walked slowly, as if the ground itself needed to remember the weight of what I'd just done. The villa had been my first real project, my secret masterpiece. 2 years earlier, I'd bought a neglected property in Mount Pleasant, with the little inheritance left to me by my grandmother, the only person in our family who had ever seen me without comparison. She used to say, "Build beauty where others see ruins." I didn't understand then how literal that advice would become. I remember the first day I saw the villa, overgrown gardens, cracked shutters, vines swallowing the walls. It smelled like salt and dust and potential. I had stood there in the middle of the empty hall, imagining light flooding through the windows, imagining a space that breathed instead of suffocated. For months, I designed every inch myself. I stripped old paint, restored oak floors, opened walls that had trapped air for decades. I filled it with soft neutrals and quiet symmetry, a language of calm I was still learning to speak. It became something sacred not because it was mine, but because it was honest. Every beam, every line of light had my fingerprints in it. Now, as the cab turned down the road toward Mount Pleasant, I watched the marshlands stretch out on both sides, silver water under a pale blue sky. The villa came into view, slowly rising from the greenery like something exhaled. The driver asked if I wanted him to wait. "No," I said. "I'll walk back." I stood at the gate for a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of salt and rosemary. The garden had grown wild again, but the bones of beauty were still there. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cool and still touched by faint traces of wood polish. Light poured in through the tall windows, scattering across the stone floors. This house had never known laughter or argument, no music or noise, only creation. Maybe that was why I loved it. It didn't pretend. It didn't need approval. I wandered through the rooms, touching the edges of door frames, the smooth grain of the staircase railing. In the main hall, the sunlight hit the wall where I'd hung a framed quote from my grandmother. "When they forget your name, build something they can't ignore." I smiled, standing there for a long time, thinking of how she used to stitch quietly by the window, saying that women who know their worth don't need to shout it. They just leave proof. That evening, back at my apartment, I laid out white silk fabric on my desk. It glowed beneath the lamp, pure and simple. I began cutting carefully, folding edges with precision. The gift box had to be perfect, soft but strong, just like the message it carried. I lined the inside with ivory paper, smooth as breath. The villa's title deed went in first, then the small handwritten note. I wrapped the box with a silk ribbon, tying it in a single loop, neat and understated. Finally, I sealed it with gold wax and pressed a small E-stamp into it. When I finished, I stepped back and looked at it. It was beautiful, quietly so. There was no malice in it, only symmetry. The box looked like peace disguised as a secret. As I cleaned the edges of my desk, a memory came uninvited. I was 16 again, watching my grandmother sew in the fading afternoon light. She'd been patching one of my dresses for school. "You don't have to fight people who can't see you, my darling," she'd said softly. "Just make something so beautiful they choke on their blindness." I hadn't understood it then, but now, as I looked at the silk box gleaming on my table, I did. Around 9, I opened my laptop and sent a message to Mr. Green. Delivery instructions, Friday 4 p.m. sharp. Hand to the bride's mother, Margaret Ward. Marked personal. His reply came almost immediately, confirmed. I closed the computer and sat in the dark, the soft hum of the city floating through the window. My phone buzzed suddenly, a group message again, Ward family chat. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Photos from the final wedding rehearsal flooded in. My mother in a pearl gown, my father smiling in his navy suit, Madeline glowing, all champagne and spotlight. No one mentioned me. I stared at the screen for a long moment before deleting the conversation entirely. Then I whispered into the empty room, perfect symmetry, all smiles, no substance. Pepper stirred beside me. I reached down to stroke his fur. "It's not revenge, boy," I said softly. "It's balance." The next morning, I stopped by the florist near my studio. I chose one single white camellia, a flower my grandmother loved. I placed it on top of the silk box just above the seal. The petals were flawless, luminous, even in shade. The courier arrived at 10 sharp, a young man with careful eyes. I handed him the package like it was fragile time. "Deliver this to the Grand Palmetto Resort," I said. "Bride's suite." "Friday afternoon?" He nodded. Understood. When the door closed behind him, I stood there for a moment, hands still hovering in the air where the box had been. The silence that followed felt different, not empty, but whole. That evening I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window. The sun melted into the horizon, painting the harbor gold. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't even feel vengeful. I just felt complete. On the table beside me lay the small wax seal I'd used to close the box. I turned it in my hand, watching the faint gold reflect the last of the daylight. My grandmother's voice whispered in memory, "When they take your voice, build with your hands instead." Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, steady and soft. I thought of the villa, its walls, its sunlight, its silence. Soon it would belong to the sister who thought I had nothing. And when she opened that box surrounded by her guests and her perfect life, she would finally see what I'd been building all along. The world had taught me that revenge was loud, messy, destructive, but this was different. This was creation as retribution, art as truth, a deed written in silence. I finished my wine, exhaled slowly, and whispered, "It's done." The room stayed still, bathed in pale gold. The white camellia's petals caught the dying light, their edges glowing faintly like forgiveness, pretending to be fire. The morning of the wedding broke bright and breathless. Charleston shimmered under a soft haze, the air rich with the smell of magnolia and salt. I woke before dawn the same way I used to before big deadlines, except this time there was nothing left to finish. The gift box was already gone, its white silk edges sealed, and perfect, carried off yesterday by the courier. Somewhere in the city, it was waiting for the moment that would rewrite everything. I brewed coffee and stepped onto the balcony. The harbor below was still caught between night and morning boats, anchored in glassy water. Pepper lay at my feet, tail thumping once, as if to say, "You've done enough." He was right. There was nothing left to control, nothing left to fix. Inside, my apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I liked that sound, the rhythm of something steady. I poured coffee into a chipped mug, took one long sip, and thought about the other side of the city where chaos would already be stirring. At the Grand Palmetto Resort, the morning would look different. There would be curling irons, perfumed laughter that sounded rehearsed. My mother would be pacing, directing hairdressers and photographers with that clipped tone she reserved for moments that mattered to her reputation. Madeline would sit in front of a vanity, surrounded by light, her white dress spilling across the carpet like ocean foam. I could picture it all the way people picture storms before they break. Around 9, I called Liam. He answered on the second ring. "Morning, architect of quiet revolutions," he said, his voice warm. "Morning," I replied, smiling faintly. "You sound calm." "I am." He paused. "So today's the day, I said. "What are you doing right now, drinking coffee?" He chuckled softly. "And on their side, hair, makeup, nerves, and denial." "That's symmetry," he said. "Different frequencies, same day." I laughed because it was true. "I'm not going," I said simply. "I didn't think you would," he replied. "But you did show up, Elena, just differently." After we hung up, I sat on the couch and let the quiet unfold. My mind drifted not backward but inward. Every sound felt sharper, every color brighter. I realized peace has its own kind of adrenaline. By 11, I walked down to the waterfront. The breeze lifted the edges of my shirt, the air warm against my skin. Charleston was alive, tourists, with cameras, couples holding hands, a street musician playing soft jazz under the oak trees. Life kept moving completely unaware that somewhere across town my family's story was about to tilt. I passed a florist setting out buckets of roses and paused watching her arrange them by color. She glanced up. "Wedding day, huh? Half the city seems to be getting married today." I smiled faintly. "Seems that way." She nodded, trimming stems. "Weddings bring out the best and the worst in people, don't they?" "Yes," I said. "They really do." Back at the Grand Palmetto, things were unraveling in ways I didn't need to witness to imagine. The ballroom had been transformed into a sea of white and gold orchids cascading from tall vases, crystal glasses lined in perfect rows, guests already beginning to arrive in polished cars. In the bridal suite, Madeline stood surrounded by bridesmaids. She was glowing, but not from joy, from pressure. Her makeup artist dabbed powder under her eyes while my mother adjusted the veil for the 10th time. "Mom," Madeline murmured, "do you think she'll come?" My mother's reflection stiffened in the mirror. "Who, Elena? She said she wasn't. And frankly, darling, that's for the best. Let's not invite shadows to the light." Madeline nodded but didn't look convinced. For a second, her hand trembled before she took another sip of champagne. Downstairs, the gift table sparkled under the chandeliers. Dozens of wrapped boxes and envelopes gleamed under the light. And there, placed perfectly in the center, sat the white silk box. The gold wax seal caught the chandelier's reflection and glimmered faintly like it knew something no one else did. The planner noticed it first. "Who delivered this one?" she asked, frowning slightly. The staff shrugged. "Came yesterday. No return name. Just says, 'For the bride.'" My mother walked by distracted, giving it a single glance. "Probably from one of her college friends," she said, already moving on. I imagined her tone as clearly as if I were standing there. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my studio, downtown, window open, a soft wind stirring the papers on my desk. I picked up an old pencil and began sketching without thinking lines of a house, sunlight through an archway, patterns of quiet symmetry. The same design language I'd poured into the villa. I realized then that I wasn't nervous, not even curious. I didn't want to see their faces. I didn't need to. The moment had already left my hands. Around noon, Liam texted, "How's the view from Peace?" I replied. "Bright, still expensive." He sent back a single emoji, an ocean wave. I laughed out loud, the sound startling even me. By early afternoon, Charleston's heat had thickened. I walked to a nearby cafe, ordered iced tea, and took a seat by the window. Outside, the sunlight bounced off cars and storefront glass, sharp enough to make people squint. Inside, everything was soft. A hum of conversation, the clink of spoons, the scent of citrus and mint. I thought about my mother's voice again. "Don't come. You'll embarrass your sister." What she didn't understand was that I wasn't the same girl she used to scold into silence. The one who washed dishes while others were praised. That girl had built something unshakable, and today it was standing quietly in a silk box with a gold seal. At the resort, I could imagine the music beginning, violins swelling as guests took their seats in the garden. The sunlight would be perfect. Madeline's dress would shimmer. My mother would be radiant, her performance flawless. For a while. Around 3, I walked home. The sky had turned pale, clouds drifting like tissue over the harbor. When I reached my building, Pepper greeted me with a happy bark. I crouched down, rubbing his ears. "It's starting now," I said. "They're probably giving speeches." He tilted his head, tail thumping. I smiled. "Don't worry, boy. The truth's on its way." As the clock neared 4, a strange calm spread through me. I poured another cup of coffee, opened the window wide, and let the air fill the room. Somewhere not far from here, a courier in a dark suit was walking through a glittering ballroom holding a white silk box. Someone would gasp. Someone would say my name. But here in this room, there was only the sound of waves and the ticking of the clock. I thought about the years I'd spent waiting for acknowledgement, the hollow ache of being unseen. It struck me how absurd it was that validation could never come from the same people who denied it. What I'd wanted wasn't revenge at all. It was proof that I'd survived them. When the church bells in the distance chimed the hour, I whispered into the quiet, "Let them open it." The air shifted, a soft wind brushing my hair, and for a moment I could almost hear it. The sudden silence, the stunned whispers, the ripple of realization. I didn't smile. I just sat there watching the horizon fade into gold and whispered to myself, balance restored. The waves rolled against the pier below, slow and steady. The sound felt like closure. As evening began to settle, I lit a candle on the table and poured myself a glass of wine. Pepper curled beside me. Somewhere in the distance, laughter echoed faintly across the city, but it didn't reach me. The gift had left my hands, but the peace that stayed. The ballroom shimmered beneath 1,000 golden lights, every reflection caught in crystal glasses and polished marble floors. Guests filled the air with laughter that sounded expensive, the kind that floated rather than landed. A string quartet played near the stage, their soft notes weaving through the perfume-heavy air. The room was a portrait of perfection, at least until the silence came. Madeline stood in the center of it all, veil cascading like a waterfall down her back. My mother Margaret was radiant in a champagne gown, moving from table to table, greeting every guest as if she were the true host of the day. "Family means everything to us," she kept saying. "We've been so blessed." The photographer snapped pictures, waiters refilled glasses, and everything looked like a scene from the magazines she lived for. Near the entrance, the gift table gleamed under the chandelier stacked high with ribbons and bows, but one stood apart. A white silk box, small, elegant, and unfamiliar. The gold wax seal glimmered beneath the light. "Should we move this one?" the planner asked, softly noticing how it didn't fit the theme. My mother waved her off. "Leave it. Probably from one of Madeline's art friends. They love to be dramatic." The box stayed where it was still gleaming, waiting. An hour later, dinner was served. Speeches were given full of polite laughter and practiced affection. My father spoke briefly, his voice deep and detached. "To my daughters," he said, raising his glass, "one who brought us pride today, and one who will always be part of us in spirit." The guests clapped, none catching the edge in his words. The evening moved on. Then came my mother's idea, opening gifts in front of everyone. "It'll make such wonderful photos," she declared. The staff began arranging boxes near the stage. Champagne glasses clinked, and a hush of polite curiosity filled the room. Madeline sat beside her new husband, smiling for the cameras, basking in her curated perfection. Her bridesmaids giggled behind her. "Open this one first," one called. Margaret scanned the stack and paused at the white silk box. "This one's unusual," she said. "Let's see what mystery friend sent this." She lifted it carefully, fingers grazing the smooth ribbon. The laughter quieted. The room seemed to lean forward. The quartet's music faded mid-note. Madeline tilted her head, curious. "Who's it from?" My mother smiled tightly. "No card on the outside. Maybe a surprise." Someone whispered, "That's from her sister, isn't it?" The photographer moved closer, camera ready. My mother untied the ribbon, the silk sliding open with a soft whisper. She lifted the lid. Inside was a folder, white leather, embossed in gold. A faint murmur passed through the crowd. She frowned, pulling it out, opening it with a practiced elegance that faltered the instant her eyes hit the first line. "Title deed," she read aloud, her voice thinning. "Residential property, Mount Pleasant, South Carolina." She stopped blinking, her face draining of color. "Owner," she swallowed. "Owner Madeline Ward." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the whispers began spreading like cracks through glass. "What is that? Did she just say a deed, Mount Pleasant? Wait, that's a villa." Madeline leaned forward, eyes wide. "What are you talking about?" She snatched the folder from her mother's hands and scanned the page. Her breath caught when she saw the embossed stamp and legal seal. The crowd murmured louder, now confusion turning to fascination. Someone whispered, "Isn't that the house from the architecture article, the one built by?" The planner tried to regain control. "Perhaps it's just symbolic, a decorative." But then my mother found the small ivory card at the bottom of the box. Her hands shook as she read it aloud, though her voice barely carried. Some things are better built from nothing. The words hung there, delicate but heavy. Madeline's husband glanced between the two women, uncertain whether to comfort or stay still. The crowd had gone completely quiet. Even the waiters had stopped moving. My mother tried to smile, lips trembling. While she said too brightly how thoughtful, her voice cracked. So unexpected. Madeline's cheeks flushed pink. She's mocking us, she whispered, eyes darting to the guests. She's making fun of me. No, my father said quietly. She's reminding you. Madeline turned on him, desperate. Reminding me of what he looked down into his glass, the corners of his mouth twitching in something close to guilt. Where the foundation came from. The words barely left his lips before phones lifted, flashes went off, and the noise returned, not laughter this time, but whispers, the kind that spread faster than truth. Across Charleston, I sat in my apartment by the harbor, the window open to the salt wind. My phone buzzed once, twice then, over and over again. I didn't check it. The rhythm of notifications was enough to tell me everything had unfolded exactly as it should. Pepper lifted his head from the rug, watching me with sleepy eyes. I smiled. It's done, I murmured. I poured another cup of coffee and leaned against the window, watching gulls drift above the water. I didn't feel vindicated or victorious. What I felt was balance, like gravity had finally shifted back into place. Back at the resort, Madeline had left the table. The photographer lowered his camera. Guests whispered behind manicured hands. The words, "Villa Gift and Sister," floated like smoke. Margaret sat still, staring at the card in her hand. She could feel the heat of every gaze. "That girl," she whispered, "she's humiliated us." "No," said my father, rising slowly from his chair. "She educated us." He turned and walked out, leaving his wine untouched. Madeline followed him with her eyes trembling. "She's ruined this." Her husband leaned close, trying to soothe her, but she pulled away. "Everyone's talking," she hissed. "I can't breathe." The planner whispered something about moving on to dessert, but the spell of perfection had already broken. The music resumed awkwardly, the notes trembling off-key. At my apartment, the sunlight shifted across the floor. I reached for the remote, turned on soft jazz, and let it fill the silence. On the counter sat an unopened bottle of red wine, the same one I'd planned to bring if I'd attended the wedding. I poured a glass, took one slow sip, and smiled. The air was thick with quiet satisfaction, the kind that didn't need witnesses. Hours later, the headlines began to appear online. "The Charleston Deed, a wedding gift no one saw coming." Subheadings followed, "When silence speaks louder than words." I didn't read the articles. I didn't need to. As the sun began to set, the harbor caught fire, with color orange melting into pink, fading into gray. Pepper sighed beside me, curling into a ball. I whispered to the fading light, "Let them learn what silence really sounds like." And somewhere across town, under the chandeliers of a broken celebration, my family sat surrounded by everything they thought they'd built, realizing for the first time that the one they'd dismissed had been building something far greater all along. When I finally went to bed, I didn't dream of them. I dreamed of the villa, sunlight streaming through its open windows, every wall whispering the same word, enough. The morning after the wedding, Charleston woke to headlines. Every newspaper, every gossip site, every social feed carried the same photo. My mother frozen, mid-smile, the white silk box open before her, and Madeline staring at the villa deed like it was a ghost. Beneath the image, the caption read, "The Charleston Deed, a sister's gift that stopped the party cold." By 8 a.m., I'd already silenced my phone. Calls from unknown numbers, interview requests, messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, all blinking at once. I set the phone face down on the counter and poured coffee. The world could talk. I didn't owe it my voice. Outside, the harbor was calm, the water smooth as glass. Pepper stretched and yawned beside me, his collar jingling softly. I watched the sunlight reach across the floorboards, gold and clean. Everything in me felt still, like a clock that had finally wound down after years of running too hard. At the resort, the stillness had shattered. Madeline's perfect world was unraveling. Her PR agent sent a statement to the press that only made things worse. "We appreciate everyone's kind interest in our family's private matters." The comments underneath were merciless. She told her sister not to come because she looked poor. And that sister gave her a house. Karma has a real estate license now. She didn't raise a glass, she raised the bar. Every post, every meme turned the story into a parable. I hadn't said a word yet, somehow I was speaking louder than I ever had. By mid-morning, Liam called. "You've seen the coverage, I've seen enough. You're trending." I laughed quietly. That's a sentence I never wanted to hear. "Don't worry. It's not scandal, it's admiration. You've become the quiet revolution everyone wishes they had the courage for." "I'm not a revolution," I said. "I just stopped pretending." He paused. "Sometimes that's all it takes." I thanked him for calling and hung up. Outside my window, the city was alive, but I stayed still. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. Across town, my mother sat at her dining table, surrounded by half-drunk champagne bottles and untouched floral arrangements. The morning light was unkind to her. Her phone kept buzzing, friends, socialites, reporters, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. When my father came downstairs, she looked up at him, eyes bloodshot. "She humiliated us." He didn't sit. She told the truth. Margaret's voice cracked. "You're defending her, I'm acknowledging her," he said simply. "Something we should have done a long time ago." She opened her mouth to argue but stopped. He'd already turned away. Madeline, meanwhile, was in her apartment, the blinds drawn, her phone vibrating relentlessly on the coffee table. She had tried to film a statement, voice trembling as she said, "Family is complicated, but love always wins." Within minutes, the comments tore it apart. Love didn't win, silence did. She should apologize, not perform. She got a house and still can't be humble. Madeline threw her phone across the room. It hit the wall, cracked the screen, and fell to the floor. Her new husband, Ethan, watched from the kitchen, his jaw tight. "Maybe it's time to stop posting," he said. She glared at him. "You think I'm the villain? I think the internet already decided." At noon, I walked to my studio downtown. The smell of sawdust and paint greeted me like an old friend. Clara, my assistant, was already there, scrolling through her phone with wide eyes. "It's everywhere," she said. "People are calling it the Charleston Deed. Some want interviews. There's even a podcast request." "No interviews," I said gently. "No comments. But they're calling you an inspiration." The woman who answered, "Humiliation with elegance." I smiled faintly. "Then let that be enough." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "You really don't want to say anything?" "I already did," I replied. They just finally listened. We spent the rest of the day working in comfortable silence. Around mid-afternoon, an email arrived from an investor I'd met months ago, someone who had politely passed on funding my firm before. "Miss Ward, if you're open to a second conversation, I think the timing might finally be right." I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying simply, "Yes." Meanwhile, social media had crowned me a symbol of poetic justice. Articles with headlines like "The Architecture of Dignity" and "When Silence Becomes Power" spread faster than I could delete them. I didn't share them, didn't even bookmark them. The villa had already done what I needed. It built truth where silence used to live. By evening, the sky turned lavender over the harbor. I took Pepper for a walk, the city glowing in the fading light. As we passed a small cafe, I overheard two women talking on the patio. "You read about that sister," one said. "The one who sent the house deed?" "Oh yes," the other replied. "I'd have done the same thing. Except I don't think I'd have done it that gracefully." I kept walking, a quiet smile on my lips. Back at home, I cooked a simple dinner, grilled vegetables, a glass of wine. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from a number I didn't recognize. "You don't know me, but I saw what you did." My mother treats me like your mother treated you. Watching you gave me courage. Thank you. I stared at the message, emotion stirring quietly beneath the calm. I typed back, "You don't need permission to live freely." Then I set the phone aside. At the same time, my mother sat in her dark kitchen clutching a glass of wine she hadn't touched. Her reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. For the first time, she wasn't sure who she was if no one was watching. Madeline's reflection looked the same in her bathroom mirror. She wiped at the remnants of her mascara, her diamond earrings catching the faint light. On the counter sat the villa deed, the paper she couldn't stop reading. It said her name, but every word screamed mine. She whispered to her reflection, "You win." But the mirror didn't answer. That night, I opened the balcony doors and let the breeze fill the apartment. Pepper curled up at my feet. The moon hung low over the water, soft and forgiving. I thought about all the years I'd tried to earn love by being useful, obedient, silent. It felt like another lifetime. I picked up my sketchbook and flipped to a blank page. Instead of drawing, I wrote 3 words in the center, "Pieces louder." Outside, fireworks erupted somewhere downtown, a wedding maybe, or just people celebrating, for reasons that had nothing to do with me. I smiled at the sound. The headlines would fade. The memes would stop. My sister's scandal would become someone else's story. But what I had built, what I'd proven, would stay. Before bed, I checked my messages one last time. A new email had arrived, subject line simple, "Thank you for your silence." It was unsigned. I didn't need to know who sent it. Some truths didn't require names. I turned off the lamp and looked out at the moonlit harbor. The water glowed silver, calm, and infinite. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. I was already there, whole, unshaken, and finally seen, even without saying a word. By the time the headlines began to fade, the world had already decided who I was. The sister of grace, the architect of silence, the woman who gifted a mansion as revenge. The names were flattering, but they didn't belong to me. They belonged to a version of me the world could understand, tidy, poetic, complete. The truth was quieter. I wasn't chasing headlines, I was building peace. Weeks passed. Charleston moved on to its next story. Yet the whispers lingered in the corners of the city's brunch tables and charity galas. People said I'd taught my family a lesson. They said karma had good taste. They said silence had style. Maybe they were right. Maybe they were just bored. I stopped checking the news after the 3rd week. The articles blurred into repetition. I didn't need to read what I already knew: that my mother had withdrawn from her social calendar, that my father had quietly stepped away from his law firm, that Madeline had deactivated her accounts after sponsors dropped her. The perfect ward image had fractured, and no amount of pearls or polish could piece it back together. One morning, Clara burst into my studio waving her phone. "You're on the cover of Charleston Living." I looked up from my sketches. "Why, they called you an unexpected symbol of modern integrity." She grinned. "They want an interview." "Decline it," I said, returning to the drawing board. Clara frowned. "You sure it could be good publicity?" "I don't need publicity," I replied softly. "I need quiet." She hesitated, then nodded. Understood. The studio fell into stillness again. Outside, the city hummed faintly, car tires over cobblestone, the low murmur of a world still spinning. I picked up my pencil and began sketching the new community center project I'd accepted the week before, a safe space for young women studying architecture and design. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt necessary. Every wall I drew was a small correction to something that had once been wrong. At noon, I took a break, stepping onto the balcony. The harbor glittered below, the air warm and clean. My phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. "Your story helped me leave a home that hurt. Thank you." I stared at the words for a long time before typing, "You built the door. You get to walk through it." When I set the phone down, my hands trembled slightly. Not from sadness, but from recognition. For years, I'd thought my silence was survival. Now I saw it for what it was: transformation. Across the city, my family was still drowning in their own noise. My mother, Margaret, had become a ghost in her own house. She rarely answered calls. Her garden wilted. The shades stayed drawn. At church luncheons, people whispered her name with pity instead of admiration. For someone who lived on perception, obscurity was its own punishment. Madeline, once radiant under the camera's glow, was fading fast. The villa in Mount Pleasant sat empty, her attempt to move in cut short by the weight of what it represented. The deed framed on her wall was a mirror she couldn't bear to look into. At night, I imagined her walking through the rooms I built, every corner reminding her who had laid the foundation. Maybe she cried. Maybe she hated me. Maybe both. I didn't wish her harm. I just hoped she understood. My father was the only one who reached out. A week after the story died down, a letter arrived at my studio. No return address, just my name, written in his narrow, careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. You were right to build something separate. I should have done the same. Take care of yourself, Elena. No apology, no signature, just truth, late but real. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into my desk drawer. It didn't sting. It didn't heal. It simply existed. That afternoon, I met Liam for coffee at a small cafe near the university. He waved when he saw me, 2 cups already waiting on the table. You look lighter, he said. I am. Fame suits you. I rolled my eyes. Don't start. He laughed. All right, all right. Tell me about the new project. I told him about the community center, the grants, the students, the plans for workshops. He listened quietly, his eyes crinkling when I spoke about giving scholarships to young women who couldn't afford tuition. You're turning your silence into structure, he said. That's rare. It's overdue, I said. He raised his cup in a small toast to overdue peace. When I returned to my studio later that day, Clara handed me another envelope, no stamp, hand-delivered. The handwriting was familiar. Inside, on thick stationery, were only 2 words. Thank you, no signature. But I knew it was from Madeline. I read the note twice. The first time I waited for resentment to rise. It didn't. The second time I felt something else entirely: release. I tore the note into small pieces, let them scatter into the trash, and whispered, "You're welcome." The following morning I woke before sunrise. The city was still half asleep, the sky a bruised blue. I packed a small bag, grabbed my keys, and drove out toward Mount Pleasant. The roads were